When we think of the Yamasee War and the battles in early Carolina, we usually imagine local native tribes fighting English settlers. But here's the twist. Europeans at the time didn't even see Carolina as separate from the Caribbean. To them, it was part of the West Indies, tied to Havana, tied to Martinique, and tied to the slave trade. And in old accounts, the Yamasee themselves were remembered as something even more mysterious, a dark, ancient people whose legacy lived on in Florida.
But before we embark, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to stay updated with our historical explorations.
In 1702, during the War of Spanish Succession, the governor of Carolina, James Moore, attacked Spanish St. Augustine with 600 Yamasee and Lower Creek warriors. It was a massive raid, land forces and naval support. But the Spanish governor, José de Zúñiga y Cerda, held out for 52 days until reinforcements arrived from Cuba. Moore had to retreat, but he didn't leave empty-handed. On his way back, Moore captured about 500 Timucua Indians along the Florida coast. Many of them were sold as slaves, not just in Carolina, but also shipped into the Caribbean slave markets, and this became a pattern. Over the next years, English raids destroyed dozens of native towns in Florida. Thousands of native people were either killed or enslaved, and many of those captives ended up in the Caribbean, fueling the plantation economy. France and Martinique joined in. By 1706, Spain struck back, with help from the French Caribbean island of Martinique. They formed a fleet of 10 ships carrying 800 men, including whites and mestés, mixed indigenous fighters, plus 200 American Indian warriors. Their mission? Invade Charlestown, Carolina. This shows how deeply tied the Southeast was to the Caribbean's military world. This is a Dutch painting of the Yamasee War in 1715, but notice the title. It calls the attack in Carolina part of the West Indies. That's how Europeans saw it back then. Carolina, Florida, Cuba, and the islands were all part of the same region, people, and culture. Carolina was a northern extension of the Caribbean. Florida fed captives into the Caribbean slave economy, and Caribbean ports supplied the ships, troops, and reinforcements that shaped these wars. So this wasn't just English versus Indians. It was a multi-ethnic war zone. Yamasee, Timucua, and other native nations. Caribbean and Floridian militias fighting for Spain. English settlers and their Indian allies raiding for captives. Even Carolina's forces grew mixed, forming militias that included black freemen by the end of the war. The Yamasee War wasn't just a local uprising, it was part of a larger Caribbean struggle. During this period, Carolina was in the West Indies, and the bloodshed, alliances, and slave trade that began in La Florida reached into the Caribbean islands, tying the fates of American Indians, the Caribbean peoples, and Europeans together in one Atlantic world. The Yamasee scattered into Florida and the Caribbean. In the book, The Yamasee Indians, From Florida to South Carolina, by William L. Proctor, award from the historic St. Augustine Research Institute, English colonists, still trying to stabilize Carolina, could not afford to allow this policy to stand unchallenged. With the outbreak of the War of Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War, as it is known in English records, 1702-13, Governor James Moore organized a combined force of about 1,000 men, including 600 Yamasee and Lower Creek Uchise warriors, to wage war against the Spaniards. In September 1702, Governor Moore and Colonel Robert Daniel launched a combined naval and land attack on St. Augustine. Governor José de Zúñiga y Cerda, 1699-1706, gathered his multiracial subjects into the Castillo de San Marcos during the 52-day siege, and when support finally arrived from Cuba, Governor Moore burned the town and withdrew. But Moore's raid did produce results. He returned to Carolina with approximately 500 enslaved Timucuas gathered along the coast. Altamaha and other Yamasee chiefs involved in Moore's raid later complained that Carolina trader John Cochran stole their plunder from St. Augustine, and the Commons House of Assembly ordered that they be given powder and shot in compensation. Although he failed to take St. Augustine, Governor Moore launched repeated raids on the Spanish colony. By 1705, Moore's forces had destroyed 32 native towns, and Florida's new governor, Francisco de Corcoles y Martinez, gathered his remaining 401 indigenous subjects into 6 new towns: Nuestra Señora de Rosario, Apalaches, Nombre de Dios, Tolomato, Santa Maria, San Francisco Potano, and Costa, said to be a town of infidels. Spanish accounts from the Archive of the Indies, which may have been inflated, record that thousands of Florida Indians were slaughtered slaughtered, and thousands more became slaves in Carolina or the Caribbean. English sources, which probably sought to minimize the carnage and the profits in their missives to the proprietors in London, put the number of killed and enslaved in the hundreds. When we look at the Yamasee in the early 1700s, they weren't just fighting on Carolina soil, they were tied directly into the Caribbean world. In 1702, during Queen Anne's War, Carolina's governor James Moore pulled together a massive fighting force, about 1,000 men, and more than half of them were Yamasee and Lower Creek warriors. They attacked Spanish St. Augustine in Florida, laying siege to the Castillo de San Marcos for 52 days. But here's where the Caribbean link comes in. The Spanish governor, José de Zúñiga, held out until help arrived, not from Florida, but from Cuba. Reinforcements sailed in from Havana, showing how Florida was protected as part of Spain's Caribbean empire. When Moore had to retreat, he didn't go home empty-handed. He marched along the Florida coast and captured about 500 Timucua Indians. These captives weren't just kept in Carolina. Many of them were sold into slavery, and the records make it clear, a large number were shipped straight into the Caribbean slave markets, fueling the plantation economy of islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and Martinique. Over the next few years, Moore's men destroyed 32 native towns in Florida. Spanish accounts say thousands were killed and thousands more were enslaved, scattered between Carolina and the Caribbean. So what does this tell us? That the Yamasee, the Timucua, and other native nations were part of a bigger story. They weren't isolated tribes. They were pulled into the same transatlantic system, captured, sold, and sent into the Caribbean. And that makes the Caribbean central to understanding the Yamasee story. The Yamasee didn't vanish. They survived. Some became part of the Seminoles, while others were literally carried into the Caribbean. This explains why Black West Indians, especially those in places like St. Lucia, Jamaica, and the Bahamas, show close cultural and ancestral ties to Yamasee identity. In Sketch of the Seminole War and Sketches During a Campaign, 1836, an officer describes the Yamasee this way. The SvnoyiWahya tribe of Seminoles are thought to be descendants of the Yamasees, as they are blacker than the other tribes, and the Yamasees are said to have been remarkably dark-complexioned. King Payne, the grandfather of Micupoy, the present governor, married his Yamasee slave and bore strong marks of his dark descent. This shows the Yamasee were remembered for being blacker than other tribes. They weren't made dark by mixing later. They were already described as a Negro-like race of American Indians. And the story of King Payne's Yamasee wife proves how Yamasee blood continued into Seminole leadership. In Researches, Philosophical and Antiquarian Concerning the Aboriginal History of America, 1829, J.H. McCullough says,
on page 25, he states, still in obscurity and belongs to that terra incognita of America, laying between the rivers Columbia and Gila. The authorities I have been able to examine respecting the present Negro appearance of the Indians in that region are as follow. The color of the Indians of the California missions seen by La Pira's Voyage 2 very nearly approaches that of the Negroes whose hair is not woolly, and in another place, the color of these Indians which is that of Negroes. Langsdorff, who visited San Francisco on the coast of California, confirms the observations of La Pira's, for he says, Voyage 440, the Indians there are of a very dark complexion, approaching the black. They have large projecting lips and broad, flat, Negro-like noses. Indeed, many of their features, as well as their physiognomy and almost their color, bear a strong resemblance to the Negroes. Their hair, however, is long and straight. From the plates and Choris voyages, of which I had but a slight examination, they appeared to resemble very nearly the blacks of Hindustan, of whom a few Mahrattas only have fallen under my personal observation. But it is well known that many of the Hindu race are only distinguished by straightness of hair from the Africans, for they are not less black. This circumstance has been noticed by Strabo as the distinction between the two races, as we cannot admit for a moment that these American blacks were ever driven by stress of weather across the Pacific Ocean to California, unless it be proved they are the descendants of Negroes left by the Spaniards. It will follow of necessity that they have been settled in America from the earliest ages. In another part of America, if reliance can be placed upon the correctness of the relation, a race of blacks were seen at so early a period of our history that it seems impossible to avoid the conclusion that they were aboriginal. Now let's take a moment to explain. What the early explorers saw there stunned them. The Indians of the California missions, described by La Pira's, were said to possess a complexion very nearly that of the Negroes, dark, rich, striking, yet with long, straight hair. A note of revelation, and Langsdorff, who walked the coasts of San Francisco, confirmed the same. They are of a very dark complexion, approaching black, their lips full, their noses broad and flat, features and physiognomy mirroring the African, yet undeniably native to this land.
This union of Yamasee and Caribbean bloodlines was so powerful that the U.S. government spent decades trying to destroy it. When you see West Indian people today, St. Lucians, Jamaicans, Bahamians, you are looking at descendants of the same struggle. We fought together, we were deported together, and we survived together. So what do the receipts show? The Yamasee were not exterminated but scattered into Florida, the Seminoles, and the West Indies. They were remembered as a dark, black-skinned people, blacker than other tribes. Scholars prove that Negro races were native to America long before Columbus. The U.S. government itself recorded the Yamasee Indians were Negroes and they were carried to the West Indies. Industrial Commission Report, Vol. Rex. This means the Yamasee are not extinct. We are still here in the Seminoles, in the Carolinas, and in the West Indian people of the Caribbean. We are the ancient black race of America, warriors who survived extermination, deportation, and erasure. And every time West Indian people fight for their dignity and survival, they are continuing the struggle of the Yamasee.
Your support means more than you know. If you've been moved by these works and want to help keep this mission alive, please consider contributing. You can make a difference right now by visiting paypal.me/SvnoyiWahya YT or send your gift directly through Cashapp at $SvnoyiWahya. Every single contribution, big or small, helps us continue sharing this history, this truth, and this passion with the world. Thank you, truly, for being a part of this journey.
Join the SvnoyiWahya membership and support the channel, and be a part of the community by becoming a member and gaining exclusive perks while supporting the channel's growth. Your support helps to create more content exploring indigenous history, culture, and stories. Click the join button and choose your level to make an impact.